when MiG-29s ambushed F-15 Eagles. The sky over Eastern Europe had always been a silent battlefield, long before the first missile was ever fired. During the final years of the Cold War, while politicians spoke in calm voices and diplomats smiled for cameras, fighter pilots on both sides trained for a war everyone feared but secretly expected. In that tense atmosphere, two legends of aerial warfare were born to hunt each other. One was the American F-15 Eagle, a machine designed with a single purpose: absolute air superiority. The other was the Soviet MiG-29 Fulcrum, built as a ruthless ambusher, fast, agile, and deadly at close range. On paper, the Eagle was untouchable. In reality, there were moments when the hunter nearly became the hunted. This is the story of one such moment, when MiG-29s came dangerously close to ambushing F-15 Eagles, exposing a side of air combat few people ever talk about. By the late 1970s, the United States was obsessed with a single nightmare scenario: Soviet fighters sweeping NATO skies, overwhelming American aircraft with sheer numbers and advanced missiles. Vietnam had already taught the U.S. Air Force a brutal lesson: technology alone was not enough. Pilots needed a fighter that could see first, shoot first, and survive. The result was the F-15 Eagle, a massive twin-engine beast with unmatched radar power, incredible climb rate, and a kill ratio that would later become legendary. The Eagle was marketed as unbeatable, and for years it lived up to that reputation. But the Soviet Union was watching closely. Soviet military planners knew they could not match the United States aircraft for aircraft in terms of radar technology or long-range missiles. Instead, they chose a different path. They designed fighters to fight dirty, using ground-controlled intercepts, surprise attacks, and brutal close-range dogfights. The MiG-29 was born from that philosophy. Smaller than the F-15, harder to detect at low altitude, and equipped with a helmet, mounted sight and high, off-bore sight missiles, it was designed to kill Western fighters before they even realized what was happening. On NATO briefing slides, the MiG-29 was described as dangerous but inferior. But pilots who actually flew against it in training exercises would later tell a different story. The real danger was not in a long-range missile exchange. The real danger was the ambush. In a typical NATO air combat scenario, F-15 Eagles would patrol high above the battlefield, relying on their powerful AN/APG-63 radar to detect enemy aircraft dozens of miles away. Once a target was detected, the Eagle would fire an AIM-7 Sparrow or later an AIM-120 AMRAAM, destroying the enemy long before visual contact. That was the theory. But the Soviets understood this playbook perfectly. Their answer was simple: deny the Eagle its greatest advantage. MiG-29 pilots were trained to fly low, sometimes just a few dozen meters above the ground, using terrain to mask their radar signature. Hills, forests, even buildings could hide a Fulcrum from an Eagle's radar until it was almost too late. Ground radar stations would guide the MiGs into position, vectoring them silently toward their prey. The F-15 pilot, confident in his radar picture, might see nothing but empty sky, right up until the warning receiver screamed. In several Cold War exercises and post-Cold War encounters, this nightmare scenario nearly became reality. One of the most revealing moments came after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when former Eastern Bloc countries began flying joint exercises with NATO. For the first time, Western pilots faced real MiG-29s, not simulations, not intelligence estimates, but actual Fulcrums flown by pilots who had trained their entire careers to kill Eagles. During one such exercise, 15 pilots were stunned. As the Eagles cruised confidently at altitude, their radar showed a clean picture. No contacts, no threats. Then suddenly, multiple radar warning tones lit up the cockpit. MiG-29s had appeared almost out of nowhere, popping up from low altitude at close range. Within seconds, the exercise controllers called kills. In a real war, those Eagles would have been dead before they ever saw their attacker. The key to the MiG-29's success was timing. The Fulcrum was not meant to fight a long battle. Its fuel capacity was limited, its radar less powerful, and its endurance short. But in the first few minutes of combat, especially inside visual range, It was terrifying. The helmet-mounted sight allowed MiG pilots to lock a missile onto a target simply by looking at it. The R-73 missile, known in the West as the AA-11 Archer, could turn at insane angles, making traditional dogfighting maneuvers nearly useless. An F-15 pilot trained to turn and climb his opponent could suddenly find himself staring at a missile launch warning, even when the MiG wasn't directly in front of him. This was the ambush the Soviets had planned for decades. From the American perspective, these encounters were a wake-up call. The Eagle was still a phenomenal aircraft, but it was not invincible. Its dominance relied on maintaining distance, altitude, and situational awareness. Take away just one of those elements, and the balance could shift dangerously fast. In debriefings after these exercises, F-15 pilots admitted something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier under the right conditions. The MiG-29 could win. But this story doesn't end there, because once the ambush was understood, the Eagles adapted. New tactics were developed. New missiles were introduced. And the chess match between East and West entered a new, deadlier phase, one that would decide whether air superiority belonged to technology, tactics, or the human sitting in the cockpit. The first close encounter, when the Eagle lost its comfort zone, the moment the distance collapsed, everything the F-15 Eagle was famous for suddenly felt fragile. At beyond visual range combat, the Eagle was king, calm, calculating, lethal. But once a MiG-29 slipped inside that invisible bubble of radar dominance, the fight transformed from a clean technological execution into raw, violent aerial instinct. This was the environment the Fulcrum had been born for. As the two aircraft closed in, the sky no longer belonged to sensors and screens. It belonged to pilots, reflexes, and nerve. In several NATO evaluation exercises during the 1990s, American F-15 pilots experienced something deeply unsettling. Their radar picture, once pristine and reassuring, became cluttered, unreliable, and in some cases completely useless. MiG-29s, guided by ground controllers, approached at extremely low altitude, using terrain to stay hidden. By the time the Eagles detected them, the Fulcrums were already climbing aggressively, converting speed into altitude, positioning themselves for a sudden merge. This was the ambush moment. Inside the cockpit of an F-15, the pilot had seconds, sometimes less, to react. The Eagle's radar, optimized for long-range detection, struggled against targets rising sharply from below. Meanwhile, the MiG-29 pilot already knew exactly where the Eagle was. Soviet doctrine emphasized cooperation between pilot and ground radar, creating a shared picture of the battlefield. While the American pilot relied on onboard systems, the MiG pilot relied on an entire network, watching the sky for him. As the distance closed, visual contact was made, and that's when the rules changed. The MiG-29 was smaller, harder to see, and shockingly agile. Its twin engines gave it explosive acceleration, and its aerodynamics allowed extreme angles of attack without stalling. In training fights, Fulcrums routinely performed maneuvers that made Western pilots uneasy: sudden nose-up climbs, violent turns, and energy dumps that looked reckless but were carefully calculated. The goal wasn't elegance. The goal was to force the fight into a chaotic, close-range spiral where the MiG's weapons could dominate. And dominate they did. The helmet-mounted sight was a revolution. Unlike traditional systems that required the aircraft's nose to point at the target, the MiG-29 pilot only needed to look. Wherever his eyes locked, the missile followed. The R-73 Archer missile could pull insane G-forces, curving through the air in ways American pilots had never seen before. During exercises, Eagles that believed they were safely out of firing position were suddenly declared killed by controllers. For F-15 pilots, this was a psychological shock. The Eagle had always fought on its own terms. It climbed higher. It flew faster. It struck from further away. But now, suddenly, it was being dragged into knife-fight territory. Dogfighting manuals that once guaranteed victory felt outdated. Pilots who had spent years training to dominate suddenly found themselves defensive, reacting instead of dictating. One American pilot later described the experience as having your comfort zone ripped away in seconds. The MiG-29 didn't need to stay in the fight for long. It only needed a brief window, one good angle, one clean lock, and the ambush was complete. Yet the story wasn't one-sided. The F-15 Eagle was no helpless victim. Even in close combat, it retained enormous advantages. Its thrust-to-weight ratio allowed it to regain energy quickly, climbing almost vertically if given even a moment of space. Its cockpit visibility was superior, giving pilots better situational awareness once the initial shock passed. And most importantly, Eagle pilots were trained relentlessly to recover from bad situations. When the first ambush attempts succeeded in exercises, the response was immediate. Tactics changed. Eagles began flying with tighter formations, overlapping radar coverage, and aggressive counter-ambush strategies. Instead of waiting high above, some Eagles deliberately descended, baiting MiGs into revealing themselves early. Others focused on breaking away vertically the moment a merge occurred, forcing the MiG to chase upward, something its limited fuel and endurance made dangerous. In subsequent encounters, the skies became a chessboard. Sometimes the MiG-29 struck first and won. Sometimes the F-15 survived the ambush, extended away, and turned the tables with a long-range kill moments later. What mattered was no longer the aircraft alone. It was timing, coordination, and the pilot's ability to stay calm when everything went wrong. These encounters shattered myths on both sides. Western analysts learned that the MiG-29 was far more dangerous than intelligence estimates had suggested. Eastern pilots learned that the F-15, even when surprised, was brutally hard to finish off. The Eagle might bleed, but it rarely died easily. And yet, the most important lesson came from what happened next. Because once the Americans truly understood the MiG-29's ambush tactics, they responded with something even more dangerous. Not just new maneuvers, but new technology. A weapon that would change the balance of air combat forever. A missile designed specifically to prevent ambushes before they ever happened. And that weapon would redefine what it meant to rule the sky. The missile that killed the ambush. The ambush only works once. That was the hard lesson the MiG-29 pilots eventually learned. Surprise is a weapon, but only as long as the enemy doesn't fully understand how it works. Once the United States Air Force accepted the uncomfortable truth that the Eagle could be hunted if it allowed the fight to collapse, they did what they had always done best. They adapted, evolved, and rewrote the rules of air combat in a way that would make the Fulcrum's greatest strength almost irrelevant. The answer came in the form of a missile that didn't just extend range, it shattered the entire concept of the ambush. The AMRAAM, 120 AMRAAM, changed everything. Unlike older missiles that required continuous radar guidance, AMRAAM was a fire-and-forget weapon. An F-15 pilot could launch, turn away, climb, descend, or engage another target while the missile hunted on its own. This single change destroyed the MiG-29's window of opportunity. The Fulcrum relied on getting close before the Eagle could react. Now, the Eagle no longer needed to wait. The moment a MiG revealed itself. Whether climbing from low altitude or briefly appearing on radar, the AMRAAM could already be on its way. What had once been a dangerous few seconds suddenly became a death sentence. In training scenarios after AMRAAM's introduction, the results were brutal. MiG-29s attempting low-altitude approaches were forced to pop up at some point to attack. That pop-up was all the Eagle needed. The F-15's radar, combined with improved data sharing between aircraft, would catch the MiG for just long enough. One launch. One call from the controller. Kill. The ambush had been neutralized. But the Americans didn't stop there. Tactics evolved alongside technology. F-15 stopped flying as isolated hunters and began operating as part of an information web. A-Bus aircraft hovered far behind the front lines, watching everything. Data links fed targeting information directly into Eagle cockpits, meaning a pilot might know about a MiG long before his own radar ever detected it. The sky was no longer a place where a single aircraft could hide. It had become transparent. For MiG-29 pilots, This was a nightmare. Their aircraft was still lethal in close combat, but getting to that close combat had become nearly impossible. Every attempt to sneak in risked revealing their position to multiple sensors. Ground-controlled intercepts, once their greatest advantage, were now vulnerable to jamming and disruption. The very system that had enabled the ambush was being turned against them. And then came the psychological shift. F-15 pilots, once cautious after early encounters with the Fulcrum, regained their confidence, but now it was backed by something far more dangerous than arrogance. It was backed by certainty. They knew that as long as they maintained distance, coordination, and discipline, the MiG-29 strengths would never come into play. The Eagle didn't need to dogfight. It didn't need to prove anything. It only needed to stay alive long enough to let the missile do its work. Real-world combat soon confirmed these lessons. In conflicts where Western air forces faced Soviet-designed fighters flown by less experienced pilots, the outcome was overwhelmingly one-sided. While not every opponent was a MiG-29, the principles were the same. Detection first. Launch first, disengage. The Eagle's kill record grew, and its legend hardened into fact. No F-15 has ever been lost in air-to-air combat, yet even in victory. The story of the MiG-29 ambush was never forgotten. Among fighter pilots, those early encounters became cautionary tales, reminders that no aircraft is invincible, and that today's advantage can become tomorrow's vulnerability. The Fulcrum had exposed a crack in the Eagle's armor, even if only briefly, and that crack forced the evolution that followed. In the end, this wasn't just a story about jets or missiles. It was a story about adaptation. The MiG-29 proved that under the right conditions, even the most dominant fighter could be threatened. The F-15 proved that recognizing weakness and responding faster than your enemy is what truly wins wars. Air superiority was never about a single machine. It was about who learned faster when the sky stopped being predictable. And somewhere above the clouds, in that silent space where seconds decide history, the lesson remains unchanged. The first mistake is often the last. The skies may look calm today, but history reminds us they were once inches away from chaos. The MiG-29 ambush proved that even legends like the F-15 Eagle could be challenged, if only for a moment. And yet, it was adaptation, not arrogance, that decided who would rule the air. Because in aerial warfare, the aircraft that survives is not always the strongest, but the one that learns the fastest. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most intense air combat rivalries ever imagined, hit like. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more cinematic military documentaries. The next story is already climbing into the sky.